So I'm very pleased to be here, and along with the productivity puzzle and the puzzle about innovation and patenting that we just heard about, there's a puzzle about why, at least in English, there have been so many popular books about GDP published in the last 3 or 4 years. So I highly commend my own to you. I think it's the best. But there are at least 10 or a dozen others recently. And as Jean-Luc said right at the start, these are not new problems. So why is it that this has become an area of such popular interest at the moment, not only among economists and statisticians, but among the general public as well? And I think the answer is that there's always been a gap between what GDP measures and economic welfare, and that gap is increasing now. And that's the sense that the general public's responding to in becoming very interested in this debate about economic measurement. As Didier said, many people say sometimes that GDP is a measure of economic activity and not an economic welfare measure, and it shouldn't be used in that way. But as soon as you deflate it and try to derive a volume measure, then you're in the world of economic welfare, because our construct is that a price index is a constant utility framework. Otherwise, we wouldn't bother with hedonic price indices. And Zvi, who developed and advocated hedonic regressions, admitted himself that the boundary between the changes that you can control for in a hedonic regression and consumer surplus is actually quite arbitrary. So we have two purposes with the statistics. We want a measure that can be used for macroeconomics or for understanding what's happening to the tax base, which is a classic reason to have a national economic aggregate at all. But we also want something to understand economic progress, economic welfare. And that's what people want in democracies, because that's part of the conversation they're having with politicians. And that's why the newspaper headlines are all about GDP went up 0.1% this quarter, even though all of us know that that's not a very meaningful number. And the point about the digital change is that it's now driving a much bigger wedge between the measures of GDP that we have that have developed over the decades and what's happening to economic welfare. And so the picture that the economic statistics are offering policymakers at the moment is inadequate. The combination is the productivity puzzle, that combination of flat measured productivity and very, very dramatic technical change in the tech industries that led in the UK to the commissioning of the review by Sir Charles Bean that was published in 2016. Because all of the tech companies like Google were saying to the then Chancellor of the Exchequer, George Osborne, how can it be that you say productivity is so weak when almost daily we're observing the dramatic technical improvements in the services that we offer and the dramatic changes in the behavior of consumers and businesses? How is none of this being reflected in the economic statistics? And so the review highlighted things like the explosion in the use of data, certainly since the arrival of smartphones in 2007 and 2008, innovations in business models, digital platforms, and so on, the digitization of products, the value placed on intellectual property and other intangibles, the sharing economy, the quality changes, the fact that all of those things that we used to buy are now apps on our smartphone and we get them for free, and so on. So as a result of the review, the Office for National Statistics got some significant extra funding, which has allowed them to do a number of different things. They have accelerated some improvements that they wanted to undertake anyway, improving some of the deflators that they use, expanding the measurement of intangibles, for example. They set up a data science campus so that they can develop new methodologies, web scraping and online price data and so on, to collect statistics. And they also funded an independent academic research centre, the Economic Statistics Centre of Excellence, the ESCO, to work on the more difficult challenges. And I lead the Measuring the Modern Economy strand of that research. So we're pulling on some of the obvious threads to try to understand the economic changes that may shed some light on this combination of great technical and behaviour change and the productivity puzzle. So one example is looking at telecommunications services deflators. If you look at the EU CLEMS database, this is one of the sectors in the UK economy that's had the slowest growth of productivity over the past 5 to 10 years. And this is, if you look at, and this is despite significant technical changes. Not only do we all have smartphones, do we all use broadband all the time, but there have been improvements in compression, in data speeds, in latency, huge investments in fiber and in data centers, not to mention the consumer investments in internet access and smartphones. So we looked at the price index used to deflate the sector's revenues. And the official index is the dark blue line at the top. And you can see that over that 5-year period, it's flat. So we then looked at one alternative, which was to take the current methodology and improve it a bit and add data services, broadband services, which hadn't been included up till then. So it's a classic new goods problem, but you put the new goods into the index and you get the red line, you get a 35% decline instead of a flat line. And then we performed a thought experiment that the engineers advocated, which is to, in effect, assume that there's complete substitutability between different communication services to construct a unit value of data index. Because to an engineer, they're all the same. And actually, they're all using the same networks, mobile, fixed networks, broadband, data, they're all using the same cabling. And if you do that, you get the bottom line. You get a unit value index declining by 90% over that same period. And in reality, consumers pay somewhat different prices for the different telecommunication services. You pay an access charge for a fixed line, and text messaging and traditional voice calls are more expensive than any of the alternatives like WhatsApp or Skype using the internet. But those prices are converging quite rapidly because consumers are switching quite rapidly as well. So we're probably in some kind of disequilibrium. So the truth is somewhere between the red line and the purple line at the bottom. And either way, it's a much more significant decline in the price than the official index has so far said. ONS will introduce the red line, the improved deflator on current methodology, and then we'll see what it will do to GDP. It's going to change the composition of output because these are intermediate services for some businesses, but it will also feed through to real GDP growth. This is one sector, and it's an important one, and the same kinds of issues will apply to a lot of other services. So the next on our list to look at is architecture and civil engineering, but you can imagine that in the legal services or accountancy services, the introduction of machine learning in those areas and AI techniques is going to do the same thing there as well. So that's one example. Second is cloud computing, where companies are replacing costly fixed investment in computer servers and proprietary software with what is in effect an intermediate purchase. They put on the company credit card, purchases from Amazon Web Services. They get a better product, it's more flexible, they get the latest technologies available, and there's constant innovation, so you can now put on your credit card AI techniques for your small business. And yet, this penalizes GDP because it's a switch from fixed investment to intermediate consumption. There's no official data on how much people are using the cloud. We've constructed some prices for some of the services. To construct a proper price index, we need to know what volume of usage there is of each of the different services. We've got Amazon and Google, and Microsoft just matches prices with those two. So we're now going to go and talk to the companies to see if we can get some volume measures, or even to understand how they think about the volume of this service. Is it bits? Is it flows of data? Is it the number of server racks they use? So the floor space of the data centers would be a proxy. But we're going to need to get new data from them. And this is an area where a change in legislation in the UK might help. The Digital Economy Act passed last year will impose a legal requirement on internet companies to provide data when ONS asks for it. So that shopping list is being developed and the discussion is taking place. But it's complicated because users can be served by data centers in other locations. It used to be Belgium that served the UK before some of the UK ones opened. And now Microsoft is putting one underwater off the coast of Scotland. And I'm not sure if that's in UK waters and whether it counts or not. A final area we looked at so far has been the production boundary, where there are obviously constantly shifts. Women moving from working in the home to working in the market, flattered GDP and productivity figures in the post-war era. In Gary Becker's famous paper on time use, you probably can't see that, but you'll know the paper anyway, he actually gave the example of the invention of the safety razor as a technical innovation that contributed to what appeared to be slow measured productivity in the service provided by barbershops. And this seems to be happening now with digital services, whether it's doing your own banking and travel agency at home, or using a sharing economy platform, or providing free internet services, cute cat videos for the entertainment of other people, or open source software. There is activity shifting from the market to the other side of the production boundary. And this seems to be happening at some scale. But again, we just don't have the data on that. Absent regular time use data and an extension of time use surveys to look at what people are doing online at home, we can't identify what the potential impact of this is on productivity. Even in a calibrated model, you can't identify everything that you need to without the data. So that's what we've done so far. On our agenda are looking at the lack of invariance of GDP to different business model innovations, and looking at contract manufacturing and what people are doing, what companies are doing with their intellectual property when they transfer it out of the company to a manufacturer they're outsourcing to. So I'm going to wrap up by talking about some wider conclusions. What are the wider issues about economic statistics to address that interest the general public has in understanding economic welfare? And my first is that we certainly need additional data collection from the digital sector itself, about data volumes, about the services they're providing, about the revenues they get from different territories. You know, we need this for tax information too. Time use surveys, I would say, are very important in a service economy, building on Becker's insight that in a service economy, you've got to build in the time it takes to consume and the time it takes to produce on both sides of the production boundary. So we need all of those. The agencies, the ONS and Insee, for historical reasons, put a lot of their resource into collecting the national account statistics. And they're incredibly sophisticated, and they've got more and more complicated over time. If the budgets aren't going to increase, and they're probably not, I would argue for a transfer of resources away from some of those activities into collecting the new kinds of data. There's a whole set, a really broad set of other challenges too. At a minimum, we know that sector classifications need to be updated, that we've got far too much about the manufacturing sector and not nearly enough about the services sector because the categories aren't there to collect the information. A big challenge to think about price indices and a whole range of problems, and I think Paul is going to talk about some of those as well. So I won't. What are the implications of the new business models, and how does that play into the kinds of surveys that the statistical agencies send to companies now? I've been interviewing sharing economy platforms. If you ask them what their revenues are, they give different answers. They conceptualize it in different ways. So that's one example. But also, I would say, what does the concept of productivity even mean in a service-based economy and intangibles-based economy? And should we be looking at time and attention as binding constraints? So if you think about time as the key economic constraint, I've got the production boundary here as the vertical division and a division to routine and non-routine activities. And if you think about how the technology is changing some of these, well, there are some happening within the market sector. There are some things that are moving across the production boundary. So rather than going to a high street travel agent now, you'll do some of that activity at home yourself. Retailing, similarly, there are now those machines in supermarkets where you can do your own checkout rather than having them do it for you. Some of the professional services, which have been entirely non-routine, are being routinized by the technology. And that's a time saving, which I think we should conceive of as an improvement in productivity. Medicine, similarly, diagnosis is one example of things that used to be extremely non-routine and labour-intensive becoming routinized by technology. Some things happening within the household sector, perhaps in future, that will change the productivity of the household sector. So we want to start thinking about capital investment by households, and typically we've only thought about housing investment in the past. And in terms of productivity, think about routine activities taking less time as the productivity gain, and non-routine activities taking more time or better quality as the economic welfare gain or the productivity gain. And finally, I think we should be thinking about exploring all the other different alternatives for measuring economic welfare, because we don't know what the right way to do it is, except it's not what we're doing now. Erik Brynjolfsson has a nice paper with some co-authors directly asking people what's their willingness to accept the loss of certain online services. And he does this through online surveys. If you want to get access to a newspaper article, sometimes it asks you to answer a question, and that's the mechanism that he's been using. I've been repeating that for the UK, doing opinion polling, so we've got unbiased samples, and we can look at the demographics of it. And the numbers are very large. People's willingness to pay is very high. One alternative would be the World Bank's approach to measuring comprehensive wealth, which is an embodiment of the capabilities approach, looking at the assets to which people have access to lead the kind of life they want to lead, or direct measurement of well-being, which I'm a little sceptical about myself, but I don't think we know how to do this properly, so we should try that too. But above all, I think it would be a mistake to ignore what all that popular interest and popular criticism of GDP is telling us. And you can't say, as I've heard some national accountants do, it's okay, we have a satellite account for that. You can't put everything interesting about the economy in the satellite accounts. And although we've had a regime change in the UK since George Osborne commissioned the Bean Review, there's certainly still great political impetus in the UK for all of this work to continue. Thank you.
Thank you.